The morning mist hung heavy over Kensington Palace as Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, stood at the tall windows of her private sitting room. Her fingers traced the cold glass while she watched the groundskeepers preparing the gardens below. Everything looked the same as yesterday, yet nothing would ever be the same again. The phone call from Balmoral had come at dawn, changing their world forever. Prince William found his wife exactly where he expected her to be. Catherine had always sought solace in quiet moments, watching the world continue its rhythm even when her own had stopped. He approached slowly, his footsteps muffled by the Persian carpet that had been a wedding gift from the Queen. The same Queen who now lay peacefully in her final rest at Balmoral Castle. "The children are asking questions," William said softly, his voice carrying the weight of sleepless hours. "George wants to know why everyone is whispering. Charlotte keeps asking when Gongon is coming for tea again." Catherine turned from the window, her eyes red-rimmed, but determined. She had been preparing for this conversation all morning, knowing that their children would need them to be strong. "What did you tell them?" "That we would talk together. As we always do." William crossed the room and took her hands in his. They were cold, despite the morning sun streaming through the windows. "How do we explain to them that the woman who taught us about duty, about service, about love for country and family, is gone?" The weight of generations seemed to settle on Catherine's shoulders. She thought of all the private moments with the Queen, the gentle guidance, the shared love for the children, the quiet conversations about the future of the monarchy. Elizabeth II had not just been William's grandmother. She had become Catherine's anchor in a world of protocol and public scrutiny. "She would want us to remember her stories," Catherine said, her voice growing stronger. The way she lit up when Louis would toddle into her sitting room. How she always had those special biscuits ready for George and Charlotte. The time she taught Charlotte to wave properly from the balcony. William smiled despite his grief. "She loved being Gongon more than being Queen, I think. At least when she was with them." They stood together in silence, both lost in memories of family gatherings at Sandringham, Easter celebrations where the Queen would hide eggs personally for each grandchild and great-grandchild, and quiet Sunday afternoons when royal protocol gave way to simply being a family. The sound of running footsteps echoed down the corridor, followed by Prince Louis's distinctive giggle. Catherine straightened, wiping her eyes quickly. "They need to see us together," she whispered to William. "They need to know that even when we're sad, we're still their safe place." The door burst open as Prince George appeared, his school uniform slightly askew. "Papa, Mama, Mrs. Henderson says there are news people at the school gates. They keep asking about Gongon. I told them she's resting, like you said." Princess Charlotte followed close behind, her young face serious beyond her years. "The ladies in the kitchen are crying. They won't tell me why." She looked between her parents with the intuitive understanding that children possess. "Is Gongon very sick?" William knelt down to be at eye level with his children, and Catherine joined him. This was the moment they had rehearsed in their minds, but hoped would never come so soon. The Queen had seemed eternal, a constant presence in their lives and the life of the nation. "Come sit with us," Catherine said gently, guiding the children to the sofa where they had spent countless family evenings. Louis toddled over, sensing the serious mood, but not understanding its source. William took a deep breath. "You know how we've talked about how some people live very long, wonderful lives, and then they go to rest forever with God?" George's eyes widened with understanding. At 9 years old, he had been slowly introduced to the realities of royal duty and the fact that one day his father would be king. "Is it Gongon?" Catherine gathered Charlotte and Louis closer. "Gongon went peacefully to sleep last night at Balmoral, surrounded by people who love her. She was very tired after such a long, beautiful life serving everyone in our country." The questions came quickly then, as children's questions do. Why couldn't the doctors help her? Would she be buried like the flowers in the garden that bloom again in spring? Where was heaven, and could they visit? William answered each question with patience, drawing on the same gentle wisdom his grandmother had shown him when his own mother died. The Queen had been there then, a steady presence helping a young boy navigate grief while the world watched. As the morning progressed, staff members appeared quietly at the door. Private secretaries needed decisions about statements to be released. The Archbishop of Canterbury would need to speak with them. Plans that had been prepared for years were now being set in motion, each detail requiring their input and approval. But, for now, in this sitting room filled with family photos and children's drawings stuck to an antique mirror, William and Catherine focused only on their children. They shared stories about the Queen's love for horses, her mischievous sense of humor, and The way she could make anyone feel special with just a smile. Will you still be Papa when you're king? Charlotte asked suddenly, the question that had been building in her young mind. William's voice was firm and reassuring. I will always be your Papa first. Just like Gongon was always a grandmother to me, even though she was queen to everyone else. Catherine watched her husband with pride and heartbreak intermingled. She could see him grappling with the magnitude of what lay ahead. The easy, private life they had worked so hard to maintain for their family was about to change dramatically. The weight of the crown, even before it was physically placed on his head, was already visible in the set of his shoulders. As noon approached, they could hear the bells of London beginning to toll. The news was spreading across the nation and around the world. Their private grief would soon become public mourning, their personal loss shared with millions who had loved the queen from afar. Catherine stood and moved to the window again. Already, flowers were beginning to appear at the palace gates. People were gathering, some crying, others simply standing in silent respect. The outpouring of love for the queen was beginning, and it would continue for days to come. The country will need us to be strong, she said quietly to William, who had joined her at the window while the children played quietly in the corner with their nanny. I know, he replied. But first, we need to say goodbye to her properly. As her family, not as her subjects. That afternoon, they would travel to Balmoral to be with the rest of the family. They would see the queen one last time, peaceful in the place she loved most. They would begin the process of planning a funeral that would honor her incredible life and service. But tonight, they would hold their children a little closer, tell them stories about their great-grandmother, and prepare themselves for the new chapter of their lives that would begin tomorrow. The chapter where William would be king, Catherine would be queen, and their children would grow up knowing that service to others was both their privilege and their responsibility. As evening settled over Kensington Palace, Catherine found herself thinking about the last conversation she had with the Queen just weeks earlier. They had talked about the children's upcoming school terms, about plans for the holidays, about ordinary, wonderful family things. The Queen had seemed tired but content, happy to hear about Louis's latest words and Charlotte's progress with her writing lessons. I'm so proud of how you've embraced this life, the Queen had said, her voice warm with affection. You've given William the partnership he needs, and you've given our family such joy. Those words felt like a blessing now, a final affirmation that Catherine had found her place in this extraordinary family. Tomorrow would bring ceremony and protocol, but tonight she would remember the woman who had welcomed her with open arms and taught her that being royal was really about loving and serving others. The palace was draped in grief, but it was also filled with love, memories, and the unbreakable bonds that would carry them through the difficult days ahead. The ancient stones of Balmoral Castle had witnessed countless royal arrivals over the decades, but none quite like this one. As the royal convoy wound through the Scottish Highlands, Catherine pressed her face to the window, watching the landscape that had brought the Queen such peace and happiness throughout her long life. The heather was in bloom, painting the hills in soft purple hues that seemed almost too beautiful for such a sorrowful day. William sat beside her in contemplative silence, his hand finding hers as they navigated the familiar curves of the road they had traveled so many times before. Usually, these journeys to Balmoral were filled with anticipation and joy. The children would be chattering excitedly about seeing their great-grandmother, about walks in the gardens, and about the special treats that always awaited them in the castle's cozy sitting rooms. Today, George sat quietly with his book, occasionally glancing up at his parents with eyes that seemed older than his years. Charlotte held her favorite stuffed animal close, while Louis dozed against his nanny's shoulder, blissfully unaware of the weight of the moment. Catherine wondered if this innocence was a gift, allowing him to simply exist in this space between before and after. I keep expecting to see her at the door, William said quietly as the castle came into view. Standing there with that smile, waiting to hear about the children's latest adventures. Catherine squeezed his hand. She understood completely. The Queen's presence had always filled Balmoral in a way that seemed almost magical. Her love for this place had been infectious, teaching all of them to appreciate the wild beauty of the Scottish countryside and the simple pleasures of family life away from the public eye. King Charles met them at the entrance, his face etched with a grief that went beyond personal loss. He was mourning his mother while simultaneously stepping into the role he had prepared for his entire life. The weight of both realities seemed to age him before their eyes. She's in the drawing room, he said simply, embracing William and Catherine in turn. She looks peaceful. more peaceful than she has in years. The family had gathered from across the country and beyond. Princess Anne stood with her characteristic composure, but Catherine could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself with military precision as if structure could hold back the tide of emotion. Prince Edward and Sophie had arrived earlier, along with their children, who moved through the castle with the same quiet reverence that had settled over everyone. Catherine took a moment to step into the garden before going inside. The Queen's favorite roses were still blooming, tended by gardeners who had served her for decades. She could almost hear the Queen's voice, pointing out a particularly beautiful bloom or explaining the history behind a certain planting. These gardens had been the Queen's sanctuary, the place where she could simply be Elizabeth, a woman who loved flowers and fresh air and watching her family play. She planted that rose bush when William was born. Came a gentle voice behind her. Catherine turned to see Prince Philip's longtime valet, now retired but still maintaining connections to the family. She said it would bloom every year to mark his birthday. It's never missed a season. The thought brought tears to Catherine's eyes. Even in her grief, she found herself marveling at the layers of love and intention that had shaped every aspect of the Queen's life. Every garden, every room, every tradition had been infused with care for her family and consideration for future generations. When she finally entered the drawing room, Catherine was struck by how small and peaceful the Queen looked. In life, her presence had filled every space she entered, but now she seemed delicate, almost ethereal. Someone had arranged her hands carefully, and she wore the simple pearl necklace she had favored for family gatherings at Balmoral. William stood beside the chair where his grandmother lay, his hand resting gently on her arm. "I was just telling her about Lewis's latest words," he said softly. She would have laughed at his pronunciation of helicopter. He still calls them heptalopters. Catherine moved to stand beside her husband, placing her own hand over his. She loved hearing about their little adventures. Remember how she used to ask for every detail about their days at school? They stood there together, sharing memories while saying their private goodbyes. Catherine found herself thinking about all the guidance the Queen had given her over the years, both spoken and unspoken. The way she had shown Catherine how to balance public duty with private motherhood, how to maintain dignity under scrutiny, how to find joy in service to others. "She taught me that strength doesn't mean never showing emotion," Catherine said quietly. "It means choosing when and how to share your feelings with others." She cried when she held Lewis for the first time. "Did you know that?" She said he reminded her of you as a baby. William smiled through his tears. "She cried at our wedding too, though she tried to hide it. I saw her wipe her eyes during the vows." Other family members came and went throughout the day, each taking their time to say goodbye privately. Catherine watched as Charles spent long minutes simply sitting beside his mother, sometimes speaking quietly, sometimes just holding her hand. The relationship between the Queen and her eldest son had been complex, shaped by duty and expectation, but the love between them was undeniable. Princess Anne's goodbye was characteristically practical but deeply felt. She adjusted the Queen's hair slightly, straightened her necklace, and whispered something that made Charles smile despite his tears. The Queen's only daughter had always been her most forthright child, and their relationship had been built on mutual respect and shared dedication to duty. As evening approached, the Archbishop of Canterbury arrived to conduct prayers with the family. They gathered in the same sitting room where the Queen had spent countless peaceful evenings, reading or working on her correspondence while the Scottish winds whispered through the ancient windows. Catherine found herself studying each face around the room, trying to memorize this moment when they were all together, united in their love for the remarkable woman they had lost. William's cousins, Peter and Zara, sat with their own children, who were struggling to understand why everyone was so sad. Princess Beatrice and Eugenie held hands, drawing comfort from their sisterhood as they had since childhood. The prayers were simple and heartfelt, focusing on gratitude for the Queen's life of service and love. Catherine felt a deep sense of peace settle over the room as they spoke together about the woman who had shaped all of their lives in profound ways. The Queen's faith had been central to her identity, providing both comfort and strength throughout her long reign. After the service, the family shared dinner together in the dining room where the Queen had hosted thousands of meals over the decades. The conversation was subdued but warm, filled with stories and shared memories. Catherine watched William as he spoke with his cousins about childhood summers at Balmoral, about the Queen's legendary sense of humor, about the way she could make anyone feel welcome at her table. She had this way of asking questions that made you feel like the most interesting person in the world, Zara was saying. Even when you were 8 years old and could only talk about horses. She remembered everything, Peter added. Every conversation, every interest, every milestone. She made mental notes about everyone she met and never forgot to follow up. Catherine thought about her own conversations with the Queen, particularly in the early days of her relationship with William. The Queen had never made her feel like an outsider or a newcomer. Instead, she had been genuinely curious about Catherine's background, her family, her interests. She had made space for Catherine in the family with such grace that the transition had felt natural rather than forced. As the evening progressed, plans for the coming days began to take shape. The Queen's body would remain at Balmoral for one more day before beginning the journey to London. There would be ceremonies to plan, protocols to follow, and a grieving nation to comfort. But, tonight, they were simply a family saying goodbye to their matriarch. Catherine excused herself after dinner and made her way back to the drawing room where the Queen lay. The room was quiet now, lit only by soft lamps that cast gentle shadows on the walls lined with family photographs. She sat in the chair beside the Queen and spoke quietly about the children, about her hopes for their future, about her gratitude for the example of service and dedication the Queen had provided. "I promise to take care of them," she whispered. "William, and the children, and this family you've built with such love. I promise to remember what you taught me about putting duty before self, about finding joy in service, about the privilege of being trusted with people's hopes and dreams." When William found her there an hour later, she was still sitting quietly, her hand resting on the Queen's arm. "What were you thinking about?" he asked softly. "About the first time she held George," Catherine replied. "How she looked at him like he was the most precious thing in the world. How she said, 'He'll be a good king someday, but first he gets to be a beloved little boy.'" She understood that we needed to protect their childhood while preparing them for their future. William nodded, settling into the chair beside her. "She told me once that the secret to surviving this life was to never forget that we're people first, royals second. That the crown is a responsibility we carry, not who we are." They sat together in comfortable silence, both lost in their own memories and thoughts about the future. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities and challenges, but tonight they could simply be two people who had loved the Queen and were grateful for the time they had shared with her. As midnight approached, other family members drifted back into the room for one final moment together. They formed a circle around the Queen, holding hands as Charles led them in a prayer of thanksgiving. Catherine felt the strength of this family bond, forged by the woman who lay peacefully before them, and she knew that it would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The Queen's legacy was not just in the institution she had served or the country she had led, but in the love she had cultivated within her own family. That love would continue to grow and spread, touching future generations and shaping the monarchy for decades to come. Westminster Abbey had witnessed the coronations and funerals of monarchs for nearly 1,000 years, but never had its ancient walls embraced such an outpouring of global love and respect. As Catherine, now the Princess of Wales, walked beside William through the Abbey's corridors one final time before the service, she could feel the weight of history and the presence of millions of people around the world who were joining them in bidding farewell to Queen Elizabeth II. The morning had begun before dawn at Windsor Castle, where they had spent their final private moments with the Queen before her public goodbye. Catherine had helped dress Princess Charlotte in her black coat and hat, carefully pinning a small brooch that had belonged to the Queen to her daughter's lapel. It was a tiny horseshoe, something the Queen had worn as a young woman, and Catherine had thought she would want Charlotte to carry a piece of her great-grandmother's spirit with her. Prince George, now second in line to the throne, had approached the day with a maturity that both impressed and saddened Catherine. At 9 years old, he understood the significance of what was happening in a way that would change his perspective forever. He had asked if he could carry a photo of himself with Gongon in his pocket, and Catherine had found one from Christmas morning, both of them laughing at something Louis had done. The nave of Westminster Abbey was filled with world leaders, heads of state, and representatives from every Commonwealth nation, but Catherine's attention was drawn to the simple crown of flowers adorning the Queen's coffin. Among the white roses and myrtle were sprigs of rosemary for remembrance, and she thought about the Queen's love for gardening, for the cycles of seasons, for the simple beauty of growing things. As they took their seats in the front row, Catherine felt the eyes of the world upon them, but her focus remained on her family. William sat with the same dignity his grandmother had always displayed in public moments. But Catherine could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the order of service just a little too tightly. She placed her hand gently over his, a small gesture of support that spoke volumes about the partnership they had built over more than a decade of marriage. The service began with words that the Queen herself had helped to choose, reflecting her deep faith and her hope that her death would be seen not as an ending but as a completion. Catherine found herself thinking about the conversations she had shared with the Queen about faith, about finding strength in service to others, about the ways that love continues even after death. When the Archbishop of Canterbury spoke about the Queen's devotion to her family, Catherine's mind drifted to a conversation from just months earlier. The Queen had been playing with Louis in the garden at Windsor, laughing as he toddled after a butterfly that seemed determined to evade his chubby fingers. "He reminds me so much of William at that age," the Queen had said, settling onto a bench while Louis continued his butterfly chase. "So curious about everything, so full of joy. I hope he gets to keep that wonder as long as possible." "You've given all of them such a gift," Catherine had replied, watching Charlotte and George help their great-grandmother feed the corgis. "They'll always remember these moments with you." The Queen had smiled, her eyes twinkling with the mischief that had delighted her family for decades. "I hope they remember that being royal is really about being useful, that all the ceremony and protocol is just the wrapping around the real gift, which is the chance to serve others and make their lives a little better." Now, listening to reading after reading celebrating the Queen's life of service, Catherine understood more than ever what a profound example she had been given. The Queen had shown her how to balance the public and private aspects of royal life, how to maintain dignity under scrutiny, how to find genuine joy in meeting people and learning about their lives. Prince Louis, at 4 years old, had been deemed too young for the full ceremony, but Catherine could see him in her mind's eye, safe at home with his nanny, probably asking when Mama and Papa would return and whether they could have pancakes for tea. The normalcy of that thought brought her comfort, reminding her that life would continue, that there would be pancakes and bedtime stories and all the ordinary moments that make up a family's life together. As the service progressed, Catherine found herself studying the faces of the congregation. She could see prime ministers and presidents, but also ordinary people who had worked for the Queen over the decades. Her dressmaker sat near her head gardener, her longtime footman beside her private secretary. The Queen had always insisted that the people who served her were part of her extended family, and she would have been pleased to see them honored with places at her final service. The most difficult moment came when the last post sounded, followed by 2 minutes of silence. In that profound quiet, Catherine could almost hear the Queen's voice, gentle but firm, offering guidance about the challenges that lay ahead. The silence was broken by reveille, a sound of hope, and new beginnings that seemed to lift the entire abbey. When it came time for the committal prayers, Catherine felt William's hand tighten around hers. This was the moment when they would say goodbye not just to the Queen, but to the world as they had known it. Tomorrow, William would wake up as the Prince of Wales, with new responsibilities and new expectations. Their children would grow up knowing that their father would one day be king, that their own lives would be shaped by duty and service in ways they were only beginning to understand. The procession from Westminster Abbey to Wellington Arch was both solemn and spectacular. Catherine sat in the state car with the children, watching the crowds of people lining the streets, many of them crying openly as the Queen's coffin passed by. Flowers were thrown into the path of the procession, and she could see people of all ages, from elderly men in military uniforms saluting their former commander-in-chief to young children waving small flags. "Look, Mama," Charlotte said quietly, pointing to a group of girl guides who had formed an honor guard outside their meeting hall. "They're wearing their uniforms like Gongon did when she was their chief guide." Catherine smiled through her tears. She would have loved that. She always said that young people were our greatest hope for the future. The journey to Windsor Castle for the private burial gave the family time to transition from the public ceremony to their personal farewell. As they drove through the countryside the Queen had loved, Catherine thought about all the times they had made this journey together, usually with the Queen pointing out changes in the landscape or sharing stories about the villages they passed through. St. George's Chapel, where Catherine and William had celebrated their wedding and watched Harry marry Meghan, felt intimate after the grandeur of Westminster Abbey. Here, surrounded by only family and close friends, they could finally grieve as people who had loved the Queen personally, rather than as representatives of the nation. The final committal service was brief, but deeply moving. As the Queen's coffin was lowered into the royal vault to rest beside Prince Philip, Catherine felt a profound sense of completion. The woman who had given her life to service, who had loved her family fiercely while carrying the responsibilities of the crown, was finally at peace. After the service, the family gathered at Windsor Castle for a reception that felt more like a family wake than a royal event. Stories were shared, tears were shed, and, gradually, the conversation turned toward the future. Catherine found herself in quiet conversations with various family members, each trying to process not just their grief, but the magnitude of the changes ahead. King Charles pulled her aside as the evening was drawing to a close. "I want you to know how grateful I am for the way you've supported William through this," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "She was so proud of the marriage you two have built, of the way you've embraced this life, while staying true to yourself." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes again. "She made it possible. She showed me how to find my place in all of this without losing who I am." "That's exactly what she hoped for," Charles replied. "She used to say that the monarchy would survive and thrive because each generation would bring their own gifts to it. She saw in you someone who would help modernize the institution while honoring its traditions." As they drove home to Kensington Palace that night, Catherine and William sat in comfortable silence, both exhausted by the emotional weight of the day. The children had fallen asleep in the car, worn out by the gravity of events they would spend years fully understanding. "What happens now?" Catherine asked quietly as they passed through the gates of their home. "Now we figure out how to honor what she gave us while building something new," William replied. "We raise our children to understand their responsibilities while letting them be kids. We serve the country while protecting our family. We find our own way of being royal while never forgetting what she taught us." Catherine nodded, feeling both the weight of responsibility and the strength of the foundation the Queen had provided. As they carried their sleeping children into the house, she thought about tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. There would be new titles to grow into, new duties to fulfill, new ways to serve. But at the heart of it all would be the lessons the Queen had taught them about love, about service, about the privilege and responsibility of being trusted with people's hopes and dreams. The palace was no longer draped in grief, but in memory and gratitude. The Queen's legacy would live on not just in the institution she had served, but in the family she had loved and shaped, and in the countless lives she had touched throughout her remarkable reign. Catherine felt honored to be part of that continuing story, and determined to help write the next chapters with the same grace, dignity, and love that Elizabeth II had shown throughout her extraordinary life. In the quiet of their home that night, as Catherine checked on each of their sleeping children and William stood looking out at the London skyline, they both felt the Queen's presence still with them, not as a loss, but as a guiding light for the journey ahead. The farewell had been said, but the love remained, eternal and unshakable, the greatest gift a grandmother could leave to the family she had cherished above all else.